Hey guys, tonight we begin with something truly soul-crushing. The glamorous world of the Victorian factory. Not the sepia-toned, top-hat and pocket watch version you've seen in period dramas where everyone sips tea and frets politely about marriage. No, I mean the real thing. A thundering, smoke-belching, finger-eating machine of a workplace where the air is 30% cotton fluff and the boss docks your pay for blinking too slowly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And a genuine thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. You have no idea how much these suggestions mean to me. This whole channel runs on your ideas, so keep them coming, and I'll keep turning history's worst days into something you can nap to. If you'd rather drift off with your eyes closed, the channel is now on Spotify too, links in the description, and if you'd like a little more, membership is already available on the channel, which gives you access to 8 hours of ad-free video to drift off to, uninterrupted, whenever you like. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft factory-adjacent hum, and get comfortable. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to work 14 hours a day next to a machine designed by someone who clearly hated you? Did Victorian workers ever get a lunch break, or was chewing considered a luxury? What happens when your alarm clock is a stranger with a long stick tapping your window at 4 in the morning? Could you survive a job where taking a sick day meant starving to death? Would you last a single shift crawling under a live power loom to grab loose cotton? Or would you accidentally unionize by hour 2 out of sheer spite? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1842. Your back already hurts, you can taste soot, and somewhere in the dark a bell is about to ruin your entire life. Good luck. It's 4 in the morning, and something is tapping at your window. No, it's not a ghost, though honestly a ghost would be more restful. It's the knocker-upper, a man paid to walk the streets with a long pole and rap on windows to wake the workers, because alarm clocks are expensive and most people can't tell time anyway. You didn't ask for this service. You can't opt out of it. He just shows up in the freezing dark like a low-budget rooster with a stick, and if you sleep through him, you're not just late, you're fined and possibly unemployed by breakfast. So you drag yourself upright in the pitch black, and the first thing that hits you is the cold. Not a gentle chill, not a grab-a-cardigan cold, but the deep, damp, bone-settling cold of a room with no heat, thin walls, and a window that fits its frame the way a stranger's coat fits your shoulders. Your breath fogs in front of you. The floor, when your bare feet find it, is cold enough to file a complaint about. Somewhere in the same room and possibly the same bed, the rest of your family is stirring too because privacy is a luxury reserved for people who own more than one room. There's no stretching, no slow easing into the day, no 5 more minutes. The knocker-upper doesn't do snooze buttons. He's already 3 windows down, tapping away, ruining someone else's morning with brisk professional cruelty. And here's the truly maddening part. You actually pay this man. A few pennies a week, out of wages you can barely spare, for the privilege of being poked awake before the sun has even considered showing up. It's the world's worst subscription service, and cancelling it means oversleeping, and oversleeping means the gate. You fumble in the dark for your clothes, because lighting a candle costs money, and you're not made of candles. Your body aches in the specific way that only comes from doing hard physical labour yesterday, the day before, and every day stretching back into a grey blur. Your hands are stiff. Your back has opinions. You're maybe 12 years old or maybe 40, and in a factory town those two things can look surprisingly similar. Think about your own mornings for a second. The soft alarm, the warm duvet, the coffee machine you can hear gurgling from the next room. The genuine agony of your feet touching a heated floor. Now strip all of that away and replace it with a stranger's stick, a freezing puddle of darkness, and the low animal dread of a bell you haven't even heard yet. That's your wake-up. That's every single wake-up 6 days a week for the rest of a life that statistically won't be very long. And the wildest thing is, nobody thinks this is strange. This is just morning. This is how it works. Half the town is up in the dark right now, coughing, shivering and shuffling toward the same brick monster you are. There's a grim solidarity in it, thousands of people all being miserable in perfect synchronization. You rub the sleep from your eyes, though it never quite leaves, and you accept the truth of your situation. The day has started whether you like it or not, and liking it was never on the menu. Somewhere out there, the mill is already warming its engines. And you, my friend, are already late in spirit, if not yet in fact. There's no heating, so you dress fast, which is easy because you own roughly 1.5 outfits. You pull on the same shirt you wore yesterday, the day before, and honestly for most of the current season, because laundry is a full-day event and you do not have a full day. The fabric is stiff with old sweat and mill grime, which, fun fact, actually helps trap warmth. So congratulations, your filth is now a feature. You lace up your boots, if you have boots, and step out into a morning so cold it feels personal. Let's linger on this wardrobe, because it deserves your pity. You have a shirt, a pair of trousers, or a dress, maybe a waistcoat or a shawl, and if fortune has ever once smiled upon you, a coat. That's it. That's the collection. There's no outfit for special occasions, no seasonal rotation, no I'll save this one for good. Every garment you own is currently on your body or drying somewhere in a state of permanent dampness. Getting dressed isn't a decision, it's just reassembling yourself out of the only pieces available. The clothes themselves are rough, coarse wool that itches, linen that's been washed into a papery ghost of itself, seams that were stitched by hand and have the structural integrity of a promise. Nothing fits properly because most clothes are handed down, patched up or bought second-hand from someone who may or may not have died in them. You don't think about that too hard. Thinking too hard is a luxury, like heating, like sleep, like socks without holes. And the smell. Look, we should address the smell. Between the accumulated sweat, the machine oil, the coal smoke soaked into every fibre, and the simple fact that washing yourself in winter is an act of reckless bravery, you smell like a chimney that lost a fight with a sheep. But here's the great equalizer. So does everyone else. The entire town shares one collective aroma, a rich bouquet of labour and damp, and your nose gave up trying to detect it years ago. Nose blindness isn't a bug, it's mercy. You dress in the dark, feeling for buttons with fingers too cold to fully cooperate. Every layer helps, so you pile on what you've got, ending up looking less like a person and more like a bundle of laundry that learned to walk. Style is not the goal. Warmth is barely the goal. The actual goal is simply covering enough of yourself that you don't freeze solid between here and the factory gate. Compare this to your closet, the one groaning with options, the one where you stand in a warm room complaining that you have nothing to wear while surrounded by 40 things to wear. Imagine explaining that sentence to someone shivering into their only shirt at 4 a.m. They'd stare at you like you'd started speaking in tongues. Nothing to wear? What a beautiful, ridiculous problem to have. There's no mirror to check yourself in, and even if there were, you wouldn't want to. What you look like is entirely beside the point. What matters is that you're vertical, you're covered, and you're moving, because the clock you can't see is ticking, and the bell you can't yet hear is winding up. So you tug your inadequate coat tighter, brace yourself against a cold that has genuinely wounded your feelings, and head for the door. The room behind you is freezing. The world ahead of you is worse, and your 1.5 outfits are somehow expected to carry you through all of it. Breakfast is a heel of bread, and if the household gods are smiling, a smear of dripping, which is the fat left over from someone else's meat that you couldn't afford. Maybe there's weak tea, brewed so thin it's basically warm water with ambition. You eat standing up, in the dark, in about 90 seconds, because lingering over a meal is for people who don't have a bell to answer to. There's no coffee to gently coax you awake, just cold bread and the grim knowledge that this is the culinary high point of your day. Let's talk about the bread, because it's the star of the show, and the show is not good. It's coarse, it's dense, and by this point in the week, it has achieved a firmness that borders on architectural. You don't so much bite it as press your face against it hopefully. Fresh bread is a memory. What you've got is a survivor, going slightly stale in the way all your food does, because there's no refrigeration and no money to buy more before it's absolutely necessary. The dripping, if you have it, is genuinely the treat. That thin, savoury smear of rendered fat is where the flavour lives, and you savour every trace of it like it's the finest butter in England. Which in your world it functionally is. Fat means calories, and calories mean you might make it through a 14-hour shift without collapsing. So this humble grease isn't indulgence, it's fuel, it's strategy. It's the difference between finishing your day and being carried out of it. The tea deserves a moment of silence. Tea leaves are expensive, so they get reused until they've given up every molecule of flavour, and then a few more times after that out of sheer principle. What ends up in your cup is a pale, apologetic liquid, warm but hollow, tea in name and hope only. Still, warmth is warmth, and wrapping your frozen hands around that cup for 30 seconds is one of the small mercies of the morning. You take your mercies where you find them. There's no sitting down for this, no table set with plates, no family gathered around chatting about their plans. You eat on your feet, moving toward the door, jamming the bread into your mouth as you go, because every second you spend chewing is a second closer to that gate. Digestion is something you'll deal with later, probably around your machine, probably while inhaling cotton dust as a side dish, and portion size. Modest is a generous word for it. You get enough to quiet the worst of the hunger, not enough to actually satisfy it, and certainly not enough to last. By mid-morning your stomach will be growling louder than the machinery, and that hollow ache will just be another thing you learn to ignore, filed away alongside the cold, the noise, and the deep existential fatigue. Now picture your own breakfast. The eggs, the toast, the fruit, the coffee, brewed strong enough to reanimate the dead, the leisurely scroll through your phone while it all settles. That entire ritual, the abundance, the choice, the sheer unhurried comfort of it, would look like a royal feast to the person choking down cold bread in the dark. You have breakfast. They have fuel, barely, administered on the run. So you swallow the last dry mouthful, drain the ghost of your tea, and steel yourself. That was breakfast. That was the best meal you'll get today, and it's still pitch dark outside. You step outside into a world painted entirely in shades of grey, and you begin the long trudge to the factory alongside a silent river of other exhausted people. Nobody's chatting. Nobody has the energy. The cobblestones are slick with something you don't investigate, and the air already tastes of coal smoke and the promise of more coal smoke. Somewhere ahead, the mill looms like a brick monster with 100 glowing eyes, and every step you take is a step closer to being partially digested by it. The cold out here has teeth. It gets into your inadequate coat, finds the gaps your 1.5 outfits can't cover, and settles into your joints for the duration. Your breath streams out ahead of you and joins the general haze, because everyone's breath and every chimney's breath and the mill's enormous smoky breath all blur together into one low, gritty fog that hangs over the whole town like a lid. The streets are narrow and crowded with houses that lean toward each other as if sharing secrets, or possibly just too tired to stand up straight. Underfoot the going is treacherous. Uneven stones, frozen puddles, and a slick film of grime, ash, and things best left unexamined. You've learned the route so well you could walk it half asleep, which is fortunate because you are in fact half asleep. Your feet know the way even when your brain has clocked out, and you're not alone. All around you, the same silent procession shuffles in the same direction, a whole population of the tired flowing through the dark toward the same destination. There's no cheerful morning banter, no how do you sleep. Everyone slept badly. Everyone knows everyone slept badly. Conversation would just waste breath you need for walking and warmth you can't spare. So the crowd moves in a strange, companionable silence. Hundreds of people utterly alone together. The smell thickens as you go. That first faint note of coal smoke deepens into a proper industrial reek, burning coal, hot oil, the sour tang of the river that no one in their right mind would drink from, and beneath it all the ever-present dust. Your lungs, already not thrilled with their career choices, take it in without complaint, because complaining isn't an option, and neither is stopping. Then the mill comes into view, and it is genuinely imposing. A vast brick structure, taller than anything else around, with rows of windows already lit from within by the gas lamps of the earliest arrivals. From here it does look like a living thing, a hulking creature crouched at the end of the street, glowing and humming and waiting to swallow the whole town's worth of workers for the day. You're walking willingly and on foot directly into its mouth. There's something almost funny about that if you're too tired to cry. Think about your commute. Maybe it's a warm car with the radio on. Maybe a train where you can sit and stare at your phone. Maybe just a short stroll with a coffee in hand. Whatever it is, you're likely awake, fed, warm, and heading somewhere with a break room and a chair that's yours. Now trade all of that for a freezing walk through a smoke-choked dark toward a building that could maim you. Suddenly your morning commute seems less like a chore and more like a spa day. But there's no time to dwell, because the gate is close now, and so is the bell. You quicken your pace along with everyone else, the silent river speeding up as one, all of you racing an alarm none of you can hear yet. You arrive at the gate, and here's where it gets fun. If the bell finishes ringing before you're through, the gate slams shut, and you're locked out. Not with a shrug and a see you tomorrow, but with a fine that can gut an entire day's wages. So the last 100 yards become a desperate shuffle run of hundreds of tired people who cannot afford to be 5 seconds late. There is no grace period. There is no traffic was bad. There is only the bell, the gate, and the overseer's clipboard, waiting to punish your ankles for betraying you. The bell itself is a genuinely stressful object. It hangs above the gate, loud enough to carry across the whole neighbourhood, and its ringing is the single most important sound in your life. It marks the exact boundary between employed today and in serious trouble. When it starts, a ripple of panic moves through the approaching crowd, and everyone who was walking is now doing that undignified half-jog of someone who desperately needs to hurry, but is too exhausted to actually run. You funnel toward the gate with the crush of other workers, all of you trying to squeeze through the same narrow opening at the same time. It's a bottleneck of the tired and the terrified, elbows and shoulders and murmured apologies, everyone acutely aware that the person ahead of them moving slowly could cost them real money. There's no room for politeness when politeness has a price tag. You slip through the gap just as the last peels fade, heart pounding, and count yourself among the lucky. Because the unlucky are right there behind you, and their morning is now a disaster. The gate closes, and whoever's on the wrong side of it is locked out. Some factories fine them a chunk of the day's pay, some turn them away entirely, no work, no wages, come back tomorrow and try not to fail again. For a person living hand to mouth, on wages already stretched to breaking, that lost money isn't an inconvenience, it's a skipped meal, a missed rent payment, a real and immediate crisis over a matter of seconds. And the reasons for being late are almost never your fault. Maybe the knocker-upper skipped your window, maybe a child was sick, maybe your legs, after years of this, simply don't move as fast as they used to. The factory does not care about reasons. The bell is not interested in your circumstances. The system is built to be merciless, precisely because your fear of it keeps you moving, keeps you rushing, keeps you arriving early out of pure self-preservation. So even after you're safely inside, your body is buzzing with the adrenaline of the near miss. You made it, but the making it cost you something, a little jolt of terror to start each day, a reminder that your livelihood balances on the edge of a few careless minutes. It's a small cruelty, repeated every single morning, and its whole purpose is to teach you to be afraid of a clock you can't even see. Picture being late for your own job, the mild embarrassment, the apologetic message, the boss who says no worries, it happens. Now imagine that a late arrival could genuinely, immediately threaten your ability to eat. That's the difference. For you, punctuality is a courtesy. Here, it's survival, enforced by a bell and a gate that have never once shown mercy. Inside now, breathing hard, you join the flood of workers heading for the floor. You survive the gate. That was only the first test. The machine is waiting, and it has never heard the word grace in its life. You step onto the floor and the whole world changes texture. It's enormous, it's dim, and it's absolutely packed with machinery stretching in endless rows like a mechanical cornfield that wants you dead. Leather belts whir overhead, connecting everything to a central steam engine that never, ever stops. This is where you'll spend the next 14 hours, and your first thought, a very reasonable one, is that no human being was ever meant to exist inside a place this loud, this hot, and this hostile to the concept of fingers. The scale of it is the first thing that gets you. The room goes on and on, a cavern of brick and iron lit by grudging gas lamps and the pale grey light leaking through grimy windows. Rows upon rows of machines fill every available inch, arranged with brutal efficiency to fit as many as possible into the space, which means the aisles between them are narrow, and the humans working them are packed in nearly as tightly as the equipment. There's no wasted room here. Room is money, and workers are cheaper than room. Above your head runs the real nervous system of the place, a forest of spinning shafts and slapping leather belts, all driven by the great steam engine that is the beating heart of the whole operation. Those belts transfer power to every machine on the floor, whirring and flapping just overhead, close enough to catch a careless bit of clothing or hair. They never stop. The engine never stops. From the moment it fires up in the morning to the moment it shuts down at night, The entire building thrums with a relentless mechanical pulse that you'll feel in your teeth. And it moves. That's the unnerving part. Everything is in motion, wheels turning, belts sliding, mechanisms clattering back and forth in their tireless rhythm. The whole floor is alive with churning metal, and you have to move through it, around it, beside it, without ever letting it touch you the wrong way. It's like walking into a giant clock and being told to work inside the gears. The machinery has no awareness of you whatsoever. It will continue doing exactly what it does whether you're in the way or not, and that indifference is somehow more frightening than malice. The light is bad, which doesn't help. Between the weak lamps and the filthy windows, everything exists in a permanent gloom, all shadows and dim shapes, and the occasional gleam of oiled metal. You have to work by feel and habit as much as by sight, which is a wonderful thing to combine with fast-moving equipment and a serious lack of safety features. Your eyes will adjust, sort of, the way they adjust to everything else here, reluctantly and never completely. Take a second to imagine your own workplace. The lighting you don't think about, the space to move, the chairs, the temperature you can actually adjust, the general baseline assumption that the room isn't trying to hurt you. Now delete all of that. Replace it with dim, cramped, roaring chaos and the firm expectation that you'll keep pace with a machine that would happily grind you up without noticing. That's your office. That's your desk. Welcome to it. Your assigned machine waits somewhere in these endless rows, and someone is already gesturing for you to take your place. There's no orientation, no training week, no gentle onboarding. You learn by doing, and doing badly here has consequences that go well beyond a stern email. You square your shoulders, swallow your very reasonable dread, and step deeper into the belly of the machine. The machines roar at a volume that has to be experienced to be believed, a wall of clattering, pounding, shrieking sound that makes conversation completely impossible. Workers learn to lip read out of pure necessity, developing a silent language of nods and gestures because shouting is useless. The noise swallows it whole. By the end of your first week, your ears ring even in your sleep, and by the end of your first year, many workers are partially deaf, which the factory considers a personal problem. It's like trying to nap inside a thunderstorm that's also being hit by a train. It's hard to overstate what the sound actually does to you. This isn't background noise you can tune out. It's a physical presence, a solid wall of clatter and thump and metallic screech that presses against your whole body. Hundreds of power looms and spinning machines all crash away at once, each one loud on its own, all of them together forming a single overwhelming roar that fills every corner of the room and every corner of your skull. You don't hear it so much as endure it. Conversation, as a concept, simply ceases to exist. You can stand right next to someone, mouth pressed nearly to their ear, bellow with everything you've got, and watch them shrug helplessly because they've caught maybe one word in 5. So the workers adapt, the way workers always adapt. They learn to read lips. They develop a whole silent vocabulary of gestures, glances, and exaggerated mouth shapes, an entire language born from necessity, spoken beneath a noise too big for actual speech. It's genuinely clever, this mute communication. A small triumph of human ingenuity over an environment designed without a single thought for human comfort. But the noise doesn't just inconvenience you, it damages you, permanently and without pause. Hour after hour, day after day, year after year, that relentless assault wears down your hearing. There are no earplugs, no protection, no acknowledgement that maybe subjecting people to this for 14 hours a day might have consequences. It just happens, gradually, to nearly everyone. The older workers are often half-deaf, straining to catch sounds outside the mill, their hearing quietly sacrificed to the machines. And the factory's position on this is a masterpiece of indifference. Your ears are your business. The strangest part is how the sound follows you home. You leave the floor at the end of your shift and the roar leaves with you, ringing on inside your head long after you've stepped into the quiet dark. It's there while you eat. It's there while you try to sleep, a phantom clatter echoing behind your eyes. Some workers say they never really hear silence again, that the mill takes up permanent residence in their skulls, humming away even on Sundays. You brought the noise home whether you wanted to or not, and it doesn't pay rent. Think about your own relationship with sound, the way you can put in headphones and choose your own soundtrack, or step into a quiet room when it all gets to be too much, or simply ask someone to turn it down. Think about how quickly you reach for silence when a noise annoys you. Now imagine that reaching for silence isn't an option. That silence has been abolished for the length of your working life, that your own thoughts get drowned out by machinery you're not even allowed to resent out loud. You take your place at your machine and let the roar close over you like water. There's nothing to do but accept it, the way you accept the cold and the dust and the hunger. It becomes the constant backdrop of your existence, the sound of your labour and eventually the sound inside your own head. And it will still be roaring long after the bell finally mercifully sets you free. Here's a delightful detail. Cotton thread snaps if the air is too dry, so the mill owners keep the rooms deliberately hot and humid, pumping in steam until the whole floor feels like a swamp with a productivity quota. You sweat through your clothes within the hour, the air is thick enough to chew, and the windows are often nailed shut to trap the moisture. It's tropical, but in the worst possible way, none of the beaches, all of the heat stroke. You'll spend the day slowly poaching in your own labour, which is a phrase no one should ever have to use. The logic behind this misery is infuriatingly sound. Cotton fibres are fragile things, and in dry air they turn brittle and break, which slows production and costs the owners money. Humid air keeps the thread supple and cooperative, so the mills are deliberately kept hot and wet to please the cotton. Not to please the workers, obviously. The workers' comfort was never a factor in any equation ever considered in this building. But the cotton gets a carefully controlled climate. You get to share it. So the rooms are steamed like a giant kettle, and the effect on a human body is immediate and unpleasant. Within the first hour your clothes are damp, then soaked, clinging to you as you work. The sweat doesn't evaporate because the air is already saturated with moisture, so it just sits on your skin, and you exist in a permanent state of clammy stickiness for the entire shift. There's no relief, no cool corner to retreat to, no moment where you dry off. You're wet at the start and wetter by the end. The heat compounds everything else. Combined with the physical labour, the crowded bodies, and the machines throwing off their own warmth, the temperature climbs to genuinely dangerous levels. Workers grow dizzy, lightheaded, and nauseous. Fainting happens. And when someone drops, the machines don't stop, the quota doesn't shrink, and the expectation to keep working doesn't soften. You're meant to push through the heat stroke the way you push through everything else, because the alternative is lost wages you can't afford. And the windows, oh, the windows. In many mills they're kept shut, sometimes even nailed or sealed, specifically to keep that precious humidity from escaping. So there's no cross breeze, no fresh air, no way to let the swamp out and the cool in. You're locked inside a deliberately created tropical climate, sealed in with the steam and the sweat and the dust, all in service of thread. The one thing that might make the room bearable is forbidden, because it would inconvenience the cotton. Picture your own experience of being too hot, the relief of air conditioning, the simple luxury of opening a window, the ability to step outside for a breath, to grab a cold drink, to take off a layer. Picture how quickly you'd complain if your workplace kept you soaking wet and dizzy for 14 hours and then nailed the window shut. You'd call someone. You'd call several someones. Here, there is no one to call, and the wet heat is simply a fixed feature of the job, as permanent as the noise. By the end of the day, you'll have sweated through everything you own. Your 1.5 outfit's now heavy and clinging, ready to go clammy and cold the instant you step back out into the winter air, a lovely transition guaranteed to help you catch a chill. But that's later. For now, you settle in at your machine, feeling the damp heat wrap around you like a wet wool blanket, and you get to work. Slowly, steadily, you begin to poach. Your workstation is a towering power loom or spinning mule, a magnificent piece of engineering with absolutely no interest in your safety. There are no guards, no emergency stops, no warning labels, just fast-moving metal and the vague expectation that you'll keep your body parts to yourself. The machines were built to be efficient, not friendly, and they treat a stray sleeve or a loose lock of hair the same way, as an opportunity. You learn very quickly that respecting the machine isn't caution, it's survival. Let's introduce your new co-worker, which is a machine roughly the size of a small room and possessed of exactly zero concern for your continued existence. The power loom clatters and slams with tremendous force, its parts flying back and forth faster than the eye can comfortably follow. The spinning mule glides and returns on its track, hauling hundreds of threads at once, driven by that tireless overhead belt. Both are marvels of their age, capable of doing the work of dozens of handworkers, and both will maim you without the slightest hesitation if you give them the chance. The complete absence of safety features is the thing that would horrify a modern eye. No protective guards cover the moving parts. No barrier stands between you and the gears. There's no button to slam in an emergency. No way to quickly stop the machine if something or someone gets caught. The equipment was designed with one goal: output, and every penny that might have gone toward keeping you alive went instead toward keeping the machine fast. Your safety was simply not part of the budget, or the plan, or the conversation. So the danger is constant and it is close. A loose sleeve, an untied apron string, a strand of hair that slipped free, any of these can be snatched by the machinery and drag the rest of you along with it. Workers learn to tie back their hair, pin their clothing tight, and keep every stray bit of themselves well clear of the moving parts, because the machine makes no distinction between cotton thread and human flesh. It grabs what comes near and pulls, and it does not know or care what it's pulling. This means you work in a state of permanent, low-grade alertness, a wariness that never fully switches off even as your body screams with exhaustion. You have to stay sharp around equipment that would happily take a hand, and you have to stay sharp for 14 hours while overheated, underfed, and half-deafened. It's a cruel combination. The job demands constant vigilance and simultaneously does everything possible to grind your vigilance down. Fatigue and fast machinery are a terrible pairing, and the factory has arranged for you to experience both at maximum intensity. Consider the modern workplace, where a wobbly chair generates an incident report, and every conceivable hazard comes wrapped in warnings, guards, training, and signs. Consider how much thought now goes into simply not letting equipment injure people. Then strip every bit of it away and stand a tired child in front of a guardless, unstoppable machine and tell them to keep up. The gulf between those two worlds is enormous, and it was paved with a great many lost fingers. You take your position, mindful of your sleeves, your hair, your hands, and every rule the older workers have drilled into you about where not to put your body. The machine roars to life beside you, indifferent and immense. You'll spend the day in its company, matching its rhythm, respecting its reach, and hoping that today, like most days, it takes only your labour and not a piece of you. Now let's talk about the smallest workers, because Victorian factories loved cheap, tiny hands. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked as scavengers and piecers, and their job was, unbelievably, to crawl beneath the running machinery to gather loose cotton and repair broken threads, while the whole thing was still moving. Small enough to fit, cheap enough to hire, and considered utterly expendable, these kids darted under live equipment all day for a fraction of an adult's pay. It's the kind of thing that makes you want to reach back through time and file a complaint with several governments at once. Understand what the job actually involved. The scavengers, often the very youngest, crawled along the floor beneath the machines to collect the loose cotton that gathered there, sweeping it up so it wouldn't clog the works. This meant reaching in among moving parts, under equipment that never stopped, in the dim and the heat and the dust, hour after hour. The piecers, a little older, leaned in over the machinery to catch broken threads and twist them back together at speed, keeping the whole operation running without a pause. Both jobs put small bodies dangerously close to fast metal, and both were done by children who should have been anywhere but here. They were hired precisely because they were small and cheap. A child could fit into spaces an adult couldn't, could dart beneath the frames and reach into gaps that grown hands never would. And they could be paid a pittance, a fraction of an adult's already meagre wage, which made them irresistibly economical to the owners. Whole families depended on these children's earnings, so parents sent their little ones to the mill not out of cruelty, but out of desperate necessity. The wages of a 6-year-old could be the difference between the family eating and not. The toll was severe. Crawling under running machinery is exactly as dangerous as it sounds, and children were injured with grim regularity. Fingers and hands caught, small bodies pulled into the works. Beyond the acute dangers, the constant labour deformed growing limbs, curved spines, and stunted development. And the exhaustion was brutal. A small child cannot work a 14-hour shift without flagging, and a child caught dozing might be smacked awake by an overseer, or splashed with water, or worse. Sleep was a luxury their tiny bodies craved and their jobs refused to allow. There was, of course, no school. These were the years when a child should have been learning, playing, growing, resting, and instead they were spent in the roaring dark beneath the machines. Childhood, as a protected time of innocence and development, simply didn't exist for the children of the working poor. They went from infancy nearly straight to labour, and many never knew anything else. The idea that a child was owed education, safety or rest would have struck the factory owners as a quaint and expensive fantasy. Hold this next to how we treat children now. The schools, the playgrounds, the fierce and layered laws protecting the young from exactly this kind of harm. The deep modern conviction that childhood is sacred and labour is for grown-ups. Every one of those protections exists because people eventually looked at scenes like this one. Small children crawling under lethal machines for pennies, and were horrified enough to demand change. The safeguards we take for granted were bought with the suffering of kids who never got to benefit from them. So as you work your own machine, spare a look for the little ones darting among the frames, doing the most dangerous work in the building for the least reward. They are the true bottom of this brutal system, and their endurance is heartbreaking. You'll see them all day, small and quick and far too tired, and you'll understand that in this place, not even childhood was spared. Presiding over your misery is the overseer, a man whose entire job is to make sure nobody rests, slows down, or experiences a single moment of comfort. He patrols the aisles with a leather strap, and he is not shy about using it, especially on the children, who might get a smack for dozing off after their 12th consecutive hour. He's part supervisor, part warden, and entirely convinced that human suffering is just good business. Think of your worst ever boss, then give him a weapon and remove every law that might restrain him. The overseer's power over you is nearly total, and he knows it. He decides whether your work is acceptable, whether your fine is warranted, whether you keep your position at all. He answers to the owners, and the owners care about one thing: output. So the overseer's whole purpose is to squeeze that output out of the workers by any means available, and the means available to him include intimidation, humiliation, and a strip of leather he keeps close at hand. He walks the floor like a shepherd guarding a flock he actively dislikes. The strap is not decorative. He uses it, freely and without consequence, on workers he judges to be slacking, and most cruelly on the children, whose small bodies and endless hours make them prone to the drowsiness that so offends him. A child nodding off at a machine after 12 hours isn't seen as a child in distress. It's seen as a problem to be corrected, and correction comes fast and stinging. There's no HR department to appeal to, no policy against it, no one to tell. The strap is simply part of the job, as accepted as the noise and the dust. His authority extends into petty tyranny too. He notes who talks, who pauses, who dares to stretch a stiff back or wipe a sweating brow. He records the fines, and every fine puts money in the factory's pocket, which means punishing you is quite literally profitable. This gives him every incentive to catch you in small failures, to interpret your every human moment as a violation, a moment's rest, a whispered word, an open window. All of it is fuel for the fine book and the strap, and he watches for it with the dedication of a man who genuinely enjoys his work. The fear he generates is the whole point. Workers who are afraid don't slow down. They don't chat, don't rest, don't risk the small comforts that might cost them a smack or a docked wage. The overseer's cruelty is a management tool, deliberately deployed to keep an exhausted, overheated, half-deafened workforce moving at pace. It's fear as a business strategy, and it works precisely because the alternative, losing wages you can't spare or a job you can't replace, is so much worse than a strip of leather. Set this against your worst workplace experience. The overbearing manager, the unfair write-up, the boss who made your stomach knot on Sunday nights. Now imagine that same figure with the legal right to physically strike you, no rules to stop him, and your entire livelihood in his hands. Suddenly the modern bad boss, for all his faults, looks almost gentle. At least you could report him. At least there were limits. Here, the overseer is the limit, and he sets it wherever he pleases. So you keep your head down and your hands moving, watching him from the corner of your eye as he prowls the aisles. You've learned his patterns, when he's near, when he's watching, when it's safe to breathe. It's an exhausting kind of vigilance, layered on top of every other exhaustion, and it lasts the whole shift. The machine wants your body. The overseer wants your fear. Between them, they get all of you. The factory has discovered that punishing you is also a way to pay you less, and it has embraced this discovery with real enthusiasm. You can be fined for being late, for talking, for whistling, for opening a window, for leaving your station, for a dirty machine, for a crooked thread, or for having the audacity to look tired. These fines pile up and get quietly subtracted from your wages, meaning some days you work a full shift and somehow end up owing the factory money. It's a rigged game where the house always wins, and the house also owns your ankles. The list of finable offences is a genuine work of art, if art could be malicious. Arriving late, obviously. Talking to a co-worker, whistling or singing, because apparently a moment of human cheer is a threat to production. Opening a window to catch a breath of air in the steamy heat. Stepping away from your machine. Leaving your workspace dirty. Producing thread with the slightest flaw. Looking, in the overseer's expert judgment, insufficiently busy. Each of these carries a penalty, and the penalties are deducted straight from your pay before it ever reaches your hands. The beauty of the system from the owner's point of view is that it turns discipline into revenue. Every rule you break saves them money, so they have every reason to make the rules numerous, vague, and easy to break. A crooked thread isn't just a mistake, it's a fee. A dirty machine isn't just untidiness, it's a fine. The more petty the rule, the more often it can be broken, and the more often it's broken, the more the factory profits. Your imperfections become a second product the mill sells back to itself, and the amounts are not trivial. A single fine could swallow a meaningful chunk of a day's wages, and several fines could erase a day entirely. There are grim stories of workers who, after a bad day of accumulated penalties, ended up having earned nothing at all, or even finding themselves in debt to their employer for the privilege of having worked a full, exhausting shift. Imagine labouring 14 hours in the heat and noise and finishing the day poorer than you started. That was a real possibility, engineered on purpose. You have no way to fight it either. There's no appeal, no arbitration, no independent judge of whether the fine was fair. The overseer decides, the amount is set, and the money vanishes from your pay. If you protest, you risk your job, and a job lost is far worse than a fine paid. So you swallow the injustice and adjust your behaviour, growing ever more careful, ever more silent, ever more afraid to open a window, or hum a tune, or simply exist as a tired human being with a body that needs things. Think about your own paycheck, and how you'd react if your employer started docking it for whistling, for talking, for looking tired, for a window. You'd be outraged. You'd have grounds to walk straight out the door and probably into a lawyer's office. The idea that a company could nickel and dime you into working for free would strike you as absurd, because there are laws now specifically to prevent it. Those laws exist because this happened routinely to people who had no such protection. So you work with one eye always on the rules, calculating the cost of every small comfort, weighing whether a moment's relief is worth the fine. The factory has made your own humanity expensive, and you've learned to ration it accordingly. It's a masterpiece of quiet cruelty, this fine system, and you pay into it every single day, one crooked thread at a time. Industrial accidents were so common they were practically part of the schedule. Fingers, hands, and whole arms were pulled into the gears with horrifying regularity, and the machines did not stop, apologize, or even slow down. If you were injured, you were dragged aside, patched up as cheaply as possible, and expected back at work as soon as you could stand, assuming you weren't simply replaced by someone with a full set of digits. There was no compensation, no insurance, and no sympathy. just an empty spot on the floor and a long line of desperate people ready to fill it. Given everything we've covered, the guardless machines, the exhaustion, the fast-moving metal, the 14-hour shifts, it's no surprise that people got hurt constantly. It was simply a matter of when. A moment's lapse in attention, a stumble, a sleeve caught at the wrong instant, and the machinery seized whatever it could reach. Fingers were the most common casualty, snatched and crushed before the worker even fully registered what had happened. But hands and arms went too, and worse besides. The mill floor was, in the plainest terms, a place where bodies got broken as a routine cost of doing business. The machines, of course, offered no reaction. There was no automatic stop, no alarm, no mechanism to halt the equipment when it caught a person. It just kept running, doing its work, indifferent to the fact that part of that work was now a human being. Co-workers might rush to help, might manage to free the injured worker, but the loom or the mule ground on regardless. That indifference is the true horror of it, not malice, just a total absence of any capacity to care, mechanical or human. The response to injury was as bleak as the injury itself. There was no ambulance, no proper medical care, no workers' compensation waiting to soften the blow. The wounded were patched up as cheaply and quickly as possible and expected back on the floor almost immediately, because a worker who wasn't working wasn't earning, and a worker who wasn't earning was a burden. If the injury was severe enough that you couldn't return, you were simply out, no pension, no support, no acknowledgement. Your spot was filled before your wound had healed, and that replaceability was the cruelest part. There was always a line of desperate people willing to take any job, no matter how dangerous, because the alternative was starvation. So the loss of a worker to injury cost the factory almost nothing. Why invest in safety when the workforce was endless and free to replace? The math was cold and simple, and it always came out in favour of the machine and against the human. You were a component, and a cheap one, and components get swapped out. Contrast this with the modern world, where a workplace injury triggers a cascade of response: medical care, compensation, investigation, safety review, legal protection. Where losing a finger on the job means your life is taken care of, not ended. Where the assumption is that the company owes you for the harm done in its service. Every bit of that framework was built in reaction to an era when none of it existed, when a lost hand meant a lost livelihood and nothing more. The safety net you'd fall into today was woven from the suffering of people who fell with nothing beneath them. So you keep your hands clear and your attention sharp, knowing the odds, knowing that any day could be the day the machine takes its due. It's a quiet terror that lives alongside all the others, and you carry it through every shift. The machine wants your labour, but sometimes it takes more, and there's no one to send the bill to but yourself. The air is full of fine cotton fibres, floating everywhere like a gentle indoor blizzard that is slowly killing everyone. You breathe it in all day, and over months and years it coats your lungs, leading to a chronic wheezing condition, the workers grimly nicknamed for the mill itself. It gets harder to breathe, then harder still, and there's no mask, no filter, and certainly no early retirement. You're essentially inhaling your own workplace, one soft, deadly flake at a time. The cotton dust is everywhere, and at first it almost seems harmless, even pretty. A fine white haze drifting through the air, settling on every surface, catching the weak light like a soft indoor snowfall. It coats your clothes, your hair, your skin. It gathers in the corners and along the beams, and with every breath you take, all day, every day, you draw it deep into your lungs, because there's no avoiding air, and the air here is thick with fibre. What looks like gentle snow is, in truth, a slow poison you can't stop consuming. Over time, the effect on the lungs is devastating. The accumulated fibres irritate and inflame the airways, and workers develop a chronic respiratory condition marked by tightness in the chest, persistent coughing, and increasing difficulty breathing. It tended to strike hardest at the start of the working week, easing slightly and then returning, a grim rhythm that told sufferers exactly what was causing it. The workers named the condition after the mill dust itself, because they understood perfectly well where it came from, even if no one in charge cared to do anything about it. And nothing was done about it. There were no masks, no respirators, no ventilation systems designed to clear the air. The dust was simply an accepted feature of the work, an occupational hazard that fell entirely on the workers to endure. The owners knew the air was thick with fibre. They lived downstream of the same profits that depended on it. But cleaning the air cost money, and workers' lungs did not appear on any balance sheet. So the haze remained, and the coughing spread, and the mills carried on exactly as before. The progression was slow and merciless. A worker might start with a mild cough, an occasional wheeze, easy enough to dismiss. But year after year the condition deepened, breathing grew harder, and what began as an irritation became a genuine disability. By middle age, many long-term workers struggled to draw a full breath, their lungs permanently scarred by decades of inhaled cotton. There was no cure, no treatment, and certainly no early retirement to escape it. You breathed the dust until you couldn't breathe well at all, and then you kept breathing it, because the work went on. Consider how seriously we now treat air quality in the workplace. The masks, the filtration, the strict limits on airborne particles, the whole apparatus of occupational health built to keep people from inhaling harmful substances on the job. Consider how unthinkable it would be to knowingly fill a room with lung-damaging dust and make people work in it for 14 hours without protection. That entire modern concern grew out of exactly this, out of generations of workers who coughed their way to early graves in the beautiful, deadly indoor snow. So you breathe it because you have no choice, drawing the fine white haze in with every lungful of the day's work. You'll cough it up at night, wheeze through your Sundays, and feel it gathering in your chest over the years. The cotton snow falls softly and endlessly around you, lovely and lethal, and there's nothing to do but keep breathing and hope your lungs last longer than the shift schedule. Between the cotton dust, the oil fumes from the machines, the coal smoke, the humidity, and the collective sweat of hundreds of unwashed bodies, the air on the factory floor is a rich, textured soup that you could almost slice. Ventilation is minimal to non-existent because fresh air costs efficiency, and the owners have made their priorities crystal clear. By midday, the atmosphere is so thick that new workers often feel dizzy and sick. It's less a room full of air and more a room full of consequences you happen to be inhaling. Let's take a full inventory of what you're breathing, because it's an impressive list. There's the cotton dust, already busy colonizing your lungs. There are the oil fumes rising off hundreds of machines, all of them greased and running hot. There's coal smoke, seeping in from the ever-burning engine and the town beyond. There's the thick humidity pumped in to please the thread. And underlying all of it, the collective human atmosphere of hundreds of overheated, sweating, unwashed bodies packed into a sealed room for 14 hours. Combine these, and you get not air but a substance, dense and layered and genuinely unpleasant to move through. The lack of ventilation is what turns a bad situation into a suffocating one. With the windows often shut to trap the precious moisture, there's nowhere for this soup to go. It just accumulates, thickening over the course of the day as more smoke, more fumes, more sweat and more dust join the mix. Fresh air would mean opening things up, letting the humidity escape, cooling the room, all of which the owners consider unacceptable losses. So the stale, saturated air stays put, growing richer and more oppressive with every passing hour. New workers feel it most acutely. Step onto the floor for the first time, and the atmosphere hits you like a wall. The smell, the thickness, the sheer difficulty of drawing a clean breath. Dizziness and nausea are common early reactions as the body recoils from an environment it was never meant to endure. In time you adapt, sort of, the way you adapt to the noise and the heat, your senses dulling in self-defense. But adaptation isn't the same as safety. Your body gets used to the poison. The poison keeps doing its work regardless. The long-term cost is written in the health of the workforce. Beyond the specific lung damage from the cotton, the general foulness of the air contributes to a broad haze of ill health, chronic coughs, frequent illness, a population of workers who never quite feel well. The combination of contaminants, heat, and crowding creates a perfect environment for both respiratory disease and the easy spread of infection. You're not just breathing bad air, you're breathing it alongside hundreds of others, sharing every germ and every particle in one great communal inhale. Picture the modern insistence on clean, fresh, well-circulated air. The ventilation systems, the air quality standards, the simple expectation that a workplace won't slowly asphyxiate you. Picture how quickly you'd flee a room that made you dizzy and sick within an hour. The gulf between that world and this one is vast, and it's measured in the countless workers who spent their days inhaling a soup of dust, smoke, oil, and sweat, because clearing it out would have cost the owners a fraction of a percent. So you take your place in the thick, standing air, letting your senses go numb to the worst of it, and you get to work. You'll breathe this all day, feel it settle into your chest, and carry a bit of it home with you every night. It's less a place with air than a place that happens to contain some heavily adulterated, and you inhale the consequences with every single breath. If you're lucky enough to get a break, it's short, sometimes barely long enough to swallow, and you often eat right at your station, dodging machinery with a hunk of bread in one hand. Cleanliness is not a concept here, so your meal comes lightly seasoned with cotton dust and machine oil, absorbed straight from the air. Some factories didn't even fully stop the machines, meaning you ate while your equipment kept running, ready to punish any lapse in attention. It's dining as an extreme sport, with a side of possible dismemberment. The break, when it exists at all, is brutally brief. We're not talking about a leisurely lunch hour with time to sit and recover. We're talking about a window barely wide enough to shove some food into your mouth before it slams shut again. There's no dedicated dining hall in most mills, no comfortable break room, no space set aside for rest. You eat where you work, standing at or near your machine, because leaving your station wastes time the factory refuses to give you. The meal is an interruption to the labour, not a pause from it. The food itself is the same grim fare that started your day. A hunk of bread, perhaps. Maybe something to go with it if you're fortunate, all of it cold and simple and inadequate. But here it comes with special seasoning. The ever-present cotton dust and machine oil hanging in the air settle onto your food as you eat. So every bite carries a light coating of the very environment that's slowly wearing you down. You're not just eating in the mill, you're eating the mill, a little more of it with each mouthful. Appetizing is not the word. And in some places the machines don't even stop. The equipment keeps running through the break, which means you're eating in the immediate presence of the same fast-moving, guardless metal that's threatened your fingers all day. Your attention can't fully relax because relaxing near a live machine is how people get hurt. So you eat with one eye on the loom, chewing quickly, staying alert, treating what should be a moment of rest as just another stretch of vigilance. The machine doesn't recognize the concept of a lunch break, and it will happily grab a distracted worker mid-bite. There's no comfort in any of it. No sitting, no chatting over a shared meal, no genuine reprieve. You bolt your food in whatever cramped, dusty spot you can find, surrounded by noise and heat and the smell of oil, and then you're right back into the work with barely a beat between. The break exists mainly to keep your body functional enough to continue, a refueling stop rather than a rest, calibrated to the minimum required to keep you upright and productive. Think about your own lunch break, the actual chair, the clean table, the time to step away, the food that hasn't been seasoned with airborne industrial particles, the simple fact that you can eat without watching for danger. Think about how a modern workplace treats a meal break as a right, a genuine pause, a bit of the day that belongs to you. Now compress it to a few frantic minutes, dust it with cotton, park it beside a running machine, and remove every comfort, and you've got lunch at the mill. It makes your own midday break look positively luxurious. So you swallow your dusty bread as fast as you can, keeping clear of the machinery, stealing what little sustenance you can before the moment ends. It's less a meal than a pit stop, and the race resumes almost before it's begun. You wipe the crumbs and the grime from your hands, take your place, and dive back into the roaring afternoon, hungry again before you know it. Let's talk about the length of your day, because it is genuinely absurd. 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours on your feet, 6 days a week, in the heat, in the noise, in the dust. There is no weekend as you'd understand it, no clocking out early, no half-day Friday. The shift begins in darkness and ends in darkness, and the sun becomes something you mostly remember rather than experience. Your entire life shrinks down to the space between the morning bell and the evening one, with barely enough time in between to sleep and start again. Sit with those numbers for a moment, because they don't fully register until you do. 12 hours would be brutal. 14 is standard. 16 was not unheard of. And this isn't a rare crunch or a busy season. This is the ordinary, everyday shape of the working life, repeated 6 days out of 7, week after week, year after year. Your body spends the overwhelming majority of its waking existence inside the mill, on its feet, tending the machine. There is no meaningful life outside of work because there is barely any time outside of work. The physical toll of standing and labouring for that long defies description. Your feet ache, then throb, then go numb. Your back becomes a permanent complaint. Your legs feel like they belong to someone else by the 10th hour, and there are still 4 to go. There's little sitting, little rest, just the endless repetition of the same movements, hour after hour after hour, while the heat presses and the noise roars and the dust falls. Fatigue stops being an event and becomes a constant condition, a baseline state you never fully climb out of, and the timing is its own quiet cruelty. You enter the mill in the pre-dawn dark and leave it in the evening dark, which means that for much of the year you simply don't see daylight except through grimy windows or in fleeting glimpses. The sun rises and sets while you're inside tending the machine, and daylight becomes an abstraction, a thing that happens to other people or on Sundays. You live a life largely conducted in artificial gloom, bookended by darkness, the natural world reduced to a rumour. There is no early finish, no flexibility, no notion that the day might end when the work is done rather than when the bell decrees. The shift is the shift, fixed and absolute, and you serve every hour of it whether the work requires it or not. Your time is not your own. It belongs to the factory from the morning bell to the evening one, and what little remains is barely enough to eat, collapse, sleep, and rise to do it all again. The relentlessness is the point. A workforce this exhausted has no energy left to resist. Measure this against the modern working day, with its 8 hours, its weekends, its holidays, its evenings that actually belong to you. Measure it against the simple expectation that work occupies part of your life rather than nearly all of it. Every one of those boundaries, the shorter day, the day of rest, the limits on how much of you an employer can claim, was fought for precisely because of days like this one, when the mill took 12, 14, 16 hours and gave back only the bare minimum needed to keep you alive to work again. So you settle in for the long haul, knowing the bell is many, many hours away, pacing yourself against an exhaustion you can't outrun. The day stretches ahead like a tunnel with no visible end. You keep your hands moving, your feet planted, and your mind somewhere far away, because that's the only way to survive a day this long. And tomorrow, the tunnel opens again. Payday sounds thrilling until you realize how little you're actually getting, and how much of it never really touches your hands. After the fines, the deductions, and the various creative subtractions, your wage is a thin trickle of coins that somehow has to feed and house an entire family. Women and children were paid even less for the same brutal work, because the factory found their desperation especially convenient. You didn't work for prosperity. You worked to postpone starvation by exactly one more week. The anticipation of payday is real, because money is survival, and you've earned this money with an entire week of your body and your health. But the actual sum when it lands is a disappointment engineered from the ground up. The base wage was low to begin with. Mill work paid little, because the labour pool was vast and desperate, and the owners knew it. And then the subtractions begin. The fines for your small human failings, the deductions for this and that, whatever creative reductions the factory has devised. By the time the coins reach your palm, the pile is thin indeed. And that thin pile has an enormous job to do. It has to cover the rent on your cramped room, the food for your family, the fuel to keep you from freezing, the endless small necessities of staying alive. There's nothing left over for comfort, nothing for saving, nothing for improvement. The wage is calibrated to survival, and no further, enough to keep you and yours breathing and working, not enough to ever get ahead. You spend the week earning it and the week spending it, and then you do it again, forever running in place. The inequality within the wages adds insult to the injury. Women doing the same exhausting work were paid substantially less than men, and children less still, not because their labour was worth less, but because their desperation could be exploited more thoroughly. The factory understood exactly who had the fewest options and paid them accordingly. A woman supporting a family, a child supporting a household, these were the workers least able to walk away, and therefore the workers squeezed hardest. Their vulnerability wasn't a reason for mercy, it was a discount the owners happily claimed. This meant whole families had to work simply to survive. A single wage couldn't sustain a household, so parents and children alike went to the mill, every available body contributing its labour to keep the family barely afloat. There was no version of this where one earner provided and the rest rested. Everyone worked, everyone contributed, and even then everyone lived close to the edge. The combined earnings of an entire toiling family added up to survival and little more, which tells you everything about how little each individual was truly paid. Hold this against the modern idea of a wage, the notion that work should provide not just survival but some measure of security, comfort, even advancement. The minimum wage, the equal pay protections, the sense that a full week of labour ought to buy more than a full week of bare existence. All of it stands in stark contrast to the mill's arithmetic, where you worked yourself ragged for a sum deliberately kept just above starvation, and where being a woman or a child meant being paid less for the identical suffering. So you take your thin handful of coins, already spoken for before you've pocketed it, and you do the grim mental math of the week ahead. Rent, food, fuel, and not a penny to spare. Payday isn't a reward, it's a reprieve, a brief postponement of the hunger that's always waiting. You've bought yourself one more week, and next week you'll buy another, and that treadmill of barely enough is the whole of what the work provides. In some places you weren't even paid in real money. You were paid in tokens or credit that could only be spent at the shop owned by, surprise, the factory. This charming arrangement, known as the truck system, meant the company set the prices, controlled the goods, and made sure you could never quite get ahead. You'd finish a grueling week only to find your entire wage owed straight back to your employer for overpriced flour and questionable tea. It's a closed loop of misery, elegantly designed so the money never actually leaves the boss's pocket. The genius of the truck system, if you can stomach calling it genius, was that it kept the factory's money inside the factory. Instead of paying you in coins you could spend anywhere, some employers paid you in tokens or store credit redeemable only at their own shop, so the wage you earned never truly became yours. It was simply a claim you could exercise at one specific counter, on one specific set of goods, at prices set by the very people who'd paid you. The money made a neat little circle from the owner's hand into yours for a moment, and right back into his shop. And because the company owned the shop and faced no competition, it could charge whatever it liked. The prices at the company store were inflated, the goods often shoddy, the flour dear, the tea suspect. You had no choice but to accept it, because your tokens were worthless anywhere else, and your family still needed to eat. There was no shopping around, no seeking a better deal, no leverage of any kind. The factory controlled both your income and your expenses, and it set both to its own advantage, ensuring that whatever it paid you it largely clawed back. The trap tightened when wages fell short of needs, which they usually did. When your credit didn't cover your family's necessities, the shop would extend you more, on account. And so you fell into debt to the company store, debt that had to be worked off, debt that bound you ever more tightly to the factory. You couldn't easily leave a job when you owed money to your employer's shop. The debt was a leash. What looked like a convenience, a shop right there for the workers, was in fact a mechanism of control, keeping you dependent, indebted, and unable to walk away. This closed the loop completely. Your labour produced goods for the owner. Your wage came from the owner. Your wage returned to the owner through his shop. And any shortfall bound you to the owner through debt. At every point in the cycle, the factory profited, and you remained exactly where you started, or worse, a little deeper in the hole. It was a system beautifully constructed to extract the maximum from workers who had the least, dressed up as a helpful amenity. Think about the modern separation between your employer and your spending. The way your wages are yours to spend wherever you choose, the way it would be scandalous for a company to pay you in credit, good only at its own overpriced store, and then loan you into dependency. That freedom, the simple ability to take your earnings and spend them anywhere, is a protection won specifically against arrangements like this one. Laws eventually outlawed the truck system precisely because it was such an obvious instrument of exploitation. So you take your tokens to the company shop, pay the inflated prices for the questionable goods, and watch your week's labour evaporate right back into the boss's ledger. Maybe you take a little on credit to cover the gap, and maybe that gap follows you into next week, and the week after. The loop turns, the debt lingers, and you remain bound to the mill by more than just need. The factory has your labour, your wage, and your custom, all at once, and it never even had to let go of the money. If the factory was hard, it was harder still for the women working it, who did the same exhausting labour for a fraction of the pay, and then went home to a second full shift of cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Pregnancy offered no mercy. Many worked right up until they gave birth and returned to the machines almost immediately, because missing wages simply wasn't survivable. They faced the same dangers, the same fines, and the same lung-clogging air, plus a whole extra helping of society assuming they should be grateful. Their endurance was staggering, and their reward was to be paid the least and thanked never. Start with the work itself, which was identical to the men's in every punishing particular. The women stood at the same machines in the same heat, breathing the same cotton snow, enduring the same 14-hour days, subject to the same overseer and the same strap and the same finable offences. The mill made no gentler demands of them, and yet they were paid noticeably less for it, their wages cut simply because they were women and the factory could get away with it. Same labour, same danger, same exhaustion, less money, a bargain for the owners, an insult to the women who bore it. Then came the second shift, the one waiting at home. A day at the mill didn't excuse a woman from the domestic labour that society still expected of her entirely. So after 14 hours at the machine, she returned to cook, to clean, to mind the children, to keep the household running on whatever scraps of energy remained. There was no rest at the end of her working day because her working day simply changed location. The men might collapse, the women carried on, folding a full domestic load on top of a full industrial one. Their labour doubled and their acknowledgement non-existent. Pregnancy and motherhood offered no reprieve, only complication. Missing work meant missing wages, and missing wages meant the family couldn't eat. So pregnant women laboured on the factory floor deep into their pregnancies, and returned to the machines with brutal speed after giving birth. There was no maternity leave, no accommodation, no mercy for a body doing the extraordinary work of bearing and delivering a child. The economics were merciless. A day not worked was a day not paid, and the family's survival didn't pause for so small a thing as childbirth. Infants were left with relatives or older siblings or worse, while their mothers returned to the raw. And atop all of this sat society's expectations, which somehow managed to demand more while offering less. A woman was supposed to labour at the mill, run the home, raise the children, and do it all with grace and gratitude. Her suffering rendered invisible by the assumption that this was simply her lot. Her exhaustion went unremarked because it was expected. Her double burden went unnoticed because it was ordinary. She was to endure it all quietly, and the quiet endurance itself became the reason no one questioned the injustice of it. Set this beside the modern conversations about equal pay, maternity leave, and the sharing of domestic labour, all the hard-won recognitions that women's work, in the factory and the home, deserves fair reward and genuine support. Every one of those advances pushes against exactly the conditions these women faced: the wage gap for identical work, the absence of any accommodation for pregnancy, the crushing assumption of a second unpaid shift. The women of the mill lived the injustice that later generations would finally name and begin to fight. So the women take their places at the machines, doing the same brutal work for less, knowing the home shift waits at the end of it, carrying pregnancies and infants and households on top of everything the mill demands. Their strength is genuinely astonishing, sustained day after day with no recognition and less reward. They are the hardest working and least thanked people on the entire floor, and they endure it all in a silence the world mistakes for consent. Let's step into one of the era's most nightmarish jobs: making matches. The young women who dipped matchsticks worked with white phosphorus, a substance so toxic it caused a horrifying condition where the jawbone itself would rot and, in the dark, actually glow a sickly green. The factories knew. They kept using it anyway because it was cheap, and the workers who complained were often dismissed. It's the kind of detail that sounds invented for a horror story, except it was simply a Tuesday for thousands of real people. The work seemed straightforward enough on the surface. Young women, many of them barely more than girls, dipped the ends of matchsticks into a mixture containing white phosphorus, then packed the finished matches into boxes, hour after hour, for wages as thin as any in the industrial world. It was tedious, repetitive labour in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms, but the true horror wasn't the tedium or the pay, it was the phosphorus itself, quietly poisoning every worker who handled it, day after day, breath after breath. White phosphorus is a genuinely vicious substance, and prolonged exposure produced a condition that afflicted the workers with almost gothic cruelty. It attacked the bones of the jaw, causing them to rot and decay from within. The affected jaw would swell, abscess, and produce a foul discharge, and in the dark the diseased bone would give off an eerie greenish glow, a detail so grotesque it hardly seems real. The only treatment was often the surgical removal of the jawbone itself, a disfiguring, agonizing operation that left survivors permanently altered. Those who weren't treated could die as the infection spread. The most damning part is that the factories understood the danger perfectly well. This wasn't a mystery ailment of unknown cause. The link between the phosphorus and the rotting jaws was recognized. Safer alternatives existed, but white phosphorus was cheaper, and cheaper won, as it always did in these calculations. The health of the young women who dipped the matches simply didn't weigh heavily enough against the cost savings, so the toxic substance stayed in use, and the workers kept falling ill, and the boxes kept getting packed. Workers who raised concerns found little sympathy. Complaint was not welcomed. Those who spoke up risked dismissal, and dismissal meant lost wages they couldn't survive without. So many suffered in silence, enduring the early symptoms, dreading the progression, trapped between a poisonous job and no job at all. The choice was grim in the extreme: keep dipping matches and risk your jaw rotting away, or lose your livelihood and risk starvation. For the desperate, poison was often the more survivable option, which tells you everything about how few options they had. Eventually, conditions like this became a rallying point, part of the long, hard struggle that would push towards safer materials, better protections, and the basic principle that a job shouldn't dissolve your bones, set the match factory beside the modern world's careful regulation of toxic substances, the safety data, the protective equipment, the outright bans on materials known to cause such harm, the whole apparatus of occupational health that keeps workers from being quietly poisoned at their stations grew, in part, from horrors exactly like this one. So spare a thought for the match girls, dipping their sticks in poison for pennies, watching their co-workers fall ill, wondering if they'd be next. Their job glowed in the dark for all the wrong reasons, and their suffering was accepted as a cost of cheap matches for years before anyone with power chose to care. It's one of the era's most nightmarish chapters, and the most chilling thing about it is how utterly ordinary it was. Just another job, just another Tuesday, just another factory doing the math and coming out against its own people. Whenever the work felt unbearable and you dreamed of quitting, one thing kept you chained to the machine: the workhouse. This was the era's grim safety net, a place so deliberately miserable that families were split up, fed gruel, and set to pointless labour, all designed to make poverty feel like a punishment. The workhouse existed specifically to be worse than any job, no matter how brutal, so that you'd cling to your factory position out of pure dread. It wasn't a fallback. It was a threat, hanging over every worker like a very bleak insurance policy. Understand what the workhouse actually was, because it shaped every decision you made. It was the institution of last resort for the destitute, the place you went when you had nothing left, no job, no home, no means of survival. But it was designed, quite deliberately, to be as unpleasant as humanly possible. The reasoning was cold and explicit. If poverty relief were even slightly comfortable, the thinking went, people might choose it over labour. So the workhouse was engineered to be worse than the worst available work, a deterrent dressed up as charity. The miseries were carefully calibrated. Upon entering, families were separated, husbands from wives, parents from children, because keeping families together might have offered comfort, and comfort was precisely what the workhouse was built to deny. Inmates wore uniforms, followed rigid rules, and were fed a monotonous, meagre diet of gruel and bread, just enough to sustain life and nothing more. The whole experience was stripped of dignity by design, poverty transformed into something that felt like a sentence for a crime you didn't commit. And the labour was its own particular cruelty. Workhouse inmates were set to tasks that were often pointless, deliberately tedious and physically grinding, breaking stones, picking apart old rope, and other soul-deadening work chosen precisely because it was joyless and hard. The point wasn't productivity. The point was to ensure that even inside the safety net, you suffered. There was to be no rest, no ease, no reprieve, only a different flavour of the same relentless toil, administered under lock and rule. This is why the workhouse functioned as a threat rather than a comfort. Its entire purpose was to make the factory, however brutal, seem preferable by comparison. And it worked. Knowing what awaited you if you lost your job, the separation, the gruel, the uniform, the pointless labour, the total loss of dignity, you clung to your position at the machine no matter how unbearable it became. The dread of the workhouse kept you compliant, kept you quiet, kept you from quitting or complaining or risking the wage you couldn't afford to lose. It was fear, weaponized into a labour policy. The shadow of it fell over everything. Every fine that ate your wages, every injury that threatened your job, every illness that might keep you home too long, all of it carried the same terrible subtext. Fail here, and the workhouse waits. It made you tolerate the intolerable, because the alternative had been specifically constructed to be worse. That was the genius and the horror of the system. It didn't just fail to help the poor, it used the fear of poverty as a tool to keep the working poor working. Compare it to the modern conception of a social safety net. The idea that support for people in hardship should be humane, that losing your job shouldn't mean losing your family and your dignity, that helping the vulnerable is a duty rather than a deterrent. Every bit of that stands in direct opposition to the workhouse philosophy, which held that relief must hurt to be justified. So you keep your head down and your hands moving, the workhouse looming at the edge of your thoughts, a bleak reminder that things could always, always be worse, and that someone had made sure of it on purpose. Now imagine all of this. The crowded floors, the locked doors, the oil-soaked machinery, the clouds of flammable cotton dust, and add a spark. Factory fires were catastrophic, spreading fast through the dust-choked air while workers struggled to escape through narrow exits that were sometimes locked to prevent theft or unauthorized breaks. Fire safety, like every other kind of safety, was an expense the owners preferred to avoid. When the worst happened, the results were devastating, and the official response was usually a shrug and a fresh recruitment notice. Consider the conditions we've already established, and you'll see the mill was practically built to burn. The air thick with fine cotton fibres, which are highly flammable, the machinery slick with oil, the lighting provided by open flames and lamps, the floors packed with people and equipment, aisles narrow, exits few. Every ingredient for catastrophe was present at all times, gathered together in one crowded, combustible space. It didn't take much. A stray spark from the machinery, a knocked-over lamp, a moment's carelessness to set the whole thing off. And when a fire started, it moved with terrifying speed. The suspended cotton dust could carry flame through the air almost explosively, and the oil-soaked wood and machinery fed the blaze eagerly. What might begin as a small fire in one corner could engulf a floor in minutes, filling the space with smoke and flame faster than the crowded workers could react. In a room already thick with dust and low on ventilation, the smoke alone could overwhelm people before the fire even reached them. Panic spread as fast as the flames, hundreds of workers all realizing at once that they needed to get out immediately. But getting out was the deadly problem. The exits were often few and narrow, inadequate for the number of people crammed onto the floor. Worse, doors were sometimes kept locked, to prevent workers from slipping out unauthorized, to stop theft, to maintain the iron control the factory prized above all else. A locked door is a minor inconvenience on an ordinary day and a mass grave during a fire. Workers desperate to escape found themselves trapped, funneling toward too small exits or hammering against doors that wouldn't open while the flames closed in behind them. The results, when the worst occurred, were horrific. Fires in crowded factories could kill many people very quickly, trapped by the flames, the smoke, the crush, and the locked or inadequate exits. These were not freak accidents so much as inevitabilities, the predictable outcome of packing people into a flammable space with insufficient means of escape. The conditions made disaster a matter of when, not if, and yet fire safety remained an afterthought at best. Sprinklers, clear exits, unlocked doors, evacuation plans, all of it cost money, and money spent on keeping workers alive was money the owners preferred to keep. The official response to such disasters was often dismally inadequate. A tragedy might prompt a shrug, a brief note of regret, and then a fresh call for workers to replace the dead. Accountability was rare, meaningful change, rarer still, at least until public outrage grew loud enough to force it. The workers who died were mourned by their families and quickly forgotten by the system that had failed them, their spots on the floor filled before the ashes had fully cooled. Set this against the modern web of fire codes, sprinkler requirements, clearly marked and unlocked exits, evacuation drills and inspections, the entire architecture of fire safety that we now take completely for granted. Every rule about a door that must remain unlocked, an exit that must stay clear, was written in response to disasters like these, paid for in the lives of workers who burned because keeping them safe was deemed too expensive. So you work amid the dust and the oil and the locked doors, and you try not to think about the spark that could come at any moment. The evening bell finally releases you, and you shuffle back out into the cold, dark streets, every muscle aching, your ears still ringing, your lungs full of the day's cotton. The walk home feels twice as long as the walk in, because now you're running on fumes and yesterday's bread. There are no streetlights worth mentioning, just the faint glow of gas lamps and the shuffle of 1,000 other broken people heading to their own cramped beds. You're not walking toward rest exactly, you're walking towards slightly less standing. The bell that torments you in the morning becomes at last a mercy in the evening, signalling the end of the shift and your release from the machine. But release is a relative term. You've spent 14 hours or more on your feet, in the heat, in the noise, and the body that carries you out the gate is a wrecked and depleted thing. Every muscle protests. Your feet, long since numb, now announce their suffering with each step. Your ears ring with the phantom roar of the machinery, and your chest is heavy with the day's inhaled cotton. You leave the mill, but the mill doesn't fully leave you. The walk home is the same route as the mornings, but transformed by exhaustion into something far longer and harder. In the morning you were merely tired. Now you're utterly spent, moving on the last dregs of energy, propelled more by habit than by strength. The cold that greeted you at dawn is back, sharper now against your sweat-dampened clothes, and the darkness has returned as well, because your entire day was bracketed by night. You never really saw the sun. You entered in blackness and you leave in blackness, the daylight having passed entirely beyond the mill walls. The streets themselves offer little comfort. There's scarcely any real lighting, just the occasional pool of dim glow from a gas lamp, leaving long stretches of shadow between. You navigate by memory and the faint shapes of the buildings, picking your way over the same treacherous cobblestones, now made worse by your fatigue and the dark. And all around you move the others, the great silent tide of fellow workers flowing homeward, as depleted as you are. Nobody speaks, everyone hurts. The whole exhausted population shuffles through the gloom toward whatever passes for home, a procession of the worn out and the used up. There's no spring in anyone's step, no relief in the release, because what waits at the end of the walk isn't luxury or rest in any meaningful sense, just a cramped room and a hard bed, and a few short hours before it all begins again. You're not walking toward comfort. You're walking toward the bare minimum of recovery, enough sleep to make your body functional for tomorrow's shift and no more. The evening isn't yours to enjoy. It's a brief interval of collapse, sandwiched between one day of labour and the next. By the time you reach your door, you're barely upright, running on nothing, your mind fogged with tiredness and your body aching in a dozen places. The walk has taken the last of whatever the mill left you, and you have just enough left to get inside, eat something and lie down. That's the whole of your evening, the trudge, the collapse, the fitful sleep, and the dread of the knocker-upper's stick. Think of your own commute home, the seat, the warmth, the daylight, the evening that actually stretches ahead of you, full of choices and rest and life. Think of arriving home with energy to spare, a whole evening yours to spend. Now strip it to a dark, freezing, aching shuffle toward a few hours of sleep, and you'll understand what the mill worker's evening truly was. Not rest. Just the shortest possible pause before the machine claimed them again. Home is a tiny room, or part of one, in a back-to-back house crammed against dozens of identical houses, all sharing walls and possibly bodies, with distressing intimacy. Whole families squeeze into a single room, and privacy is a fairy tale you tell yourself to feel better. The walls are damp, the ceiling is low, and the general vibe is a slightly nicer barn. After a 14-hour shift, though, even this counts as heaven, mostly because it's the only place the overseer can't fine you. The housing of the industrial towns was a marvel of cramming as many people as possible into as little space as possible, and your home reflects that ambition perfectly. The back-to-back houses were built literally sharing rear walls with the row behind them, packed together in dense, sunless rows, so that entire families lived in what amounted to a single room or two, wall to wall, with their neighbours on every side. There's no space to spare, no room to breathe, just human beings stacked and squeezed into the smallest footprint the builders could manage, while still calling it a dwelling. Inside, the conditions are grim in every particular. The walls are damp, moisture seeping through and breeding mould. The single room must serve as kitchen, bedroom, living space, and everything else, for the whole family at once. There's little furniture, less comfort, and no privacy whatsoever. You eat, sleep, wash, and live in the constant presence of everyone you're related to, because there's simply nowhere else to be. The idea of a private moment, a room of your own, a door you could close, belongs to another world entirely, one you'll never inhabit. The overcrowding extends beyond your own walls. The whole neighbourhood is packed to bursting, families crammed into every room of every house, the streets narrow and airless between them. Sanitation is minimal, often a single privy shared among many households, and a water source shared by more. The density that makes the housing so cheap for the landlords makes it a breeding ground for disease and misery for the people who live in it. You're never truly alone, and you're never truly clean, and the two facts are closely related. And yet, after a 14-hour shift in the roaring, steaming, dust-choked mill, this cramped and damp little room is where you long to be. It's not comfortable, not by any honest measure, but it's yours in a way the factory floor never is. Here, the overseer can't reach you. Here, no bell rings, no strap swings, no finer crews. The machine can't touch you within these damp walls. So despite everything wrong with it, the crowding, the damp, the lack of air and privacy and space, it becomes a refuge, precisely because it's the one place the mill's authority doesn't follow. That's the low bar the factory has set for your life. Home is heaven not because it's good, but because work is so much worse. A slightly nicer barn feels like sanctuary when the alternative is 14 hours of dust and danger and fear. You've been ground down to the point where a damp single room shared with your whole family registers as blessed relief, and that recalibration of comfort tells you everything about the world you're living in. Set it beside the modern expectation of home, the space, the privacy, the warmth, the sanitation, the simple assumption that a dwelling should be a comfortable place to actually live. The vast distance between that and a damp back-to-back room shared by an entire family is a measure of how far housing and human dignity have come. So you step into your tiny home, grateful in the strange, diminished way the mill has taught you, and you claim your small square of the one place that's yours. Let's talk hydration, Victorian style, which is to say, let's talk about how the water is basically a loaded weapon. Sanitation in the crowded industrial towns was catastrophic, with sewage and drinking water sharing far too much real estate for anyone's comfort. Cholera swept through these neighborhoods in devastating waves, killing thousands, and nobody yet fully understood why. So you drink the water and roll the dice, or you drink weak beer instead, which is honestly the more sensible medical decision available to you. The sanitation situation in the industrial towns was, to put it plainly, a catastrophe. Cram tens of thousands of people into dense, hastily built neighborhoods with inadequate drainage and no proper sewage system, and the results are exactly as grim as you'd expect. Waste accumulated in courtyards and streets, drained into the same waterways that supplied drinking water, and generally mingled with daily life in ways that would horrify anyone with a modern understanding of germs. But nobody had that understanding yet, and so the filth and the water flowed together, uncontested. The drinking water drawn from these contaminated sources was frequently a vehicle for disease. Sewage and water supply overlapped disastrously, meaning the water you drank to survive might well carry the very thing that would kill you. There was no reliable way to know which water was safe and which was lethal. A clear-looking pump could be as deadly as a visibly foul one. You drank because you had to, and in drinking you gambled every single time, with odds you couldn't calculate and stakes that were your life. The consequence was cholera, which swept through the industrial towns in terrible epidemic waves. The disease killed swiftly and horribly, dehydrating its victims to death, and it moved through the crowded, unsanitary neighborhoods with devastating efficiency, claiming thousands in a single outbreak. Whole communities were ravaged, families destroyed, the death toll staggering, and because the true cause, contaminated water, wasn't yet understood, the epidemics recurred, striking again and again before the crucial connection between the water and the sickness was finally established. This left the working poor with a genuinely dismal set of choices. Drink the water and risk cholera and other waterborne diseases, or find something safer to drink. And the safer option, remarkably, was weak beer, small beer, low in alcohol, made with water that had been boiled during brewing, which killed the very pathogens that made the raw water so dangerous. So drinking beer wasn't indulgence. It was, quite literally, the more sensible medical decision, a way to hydrate without playing Russian roulette with the local pump. It says something profound about the water, that mild alcohol was the responsible choice. The whole grim arrangement flowed from the same source as every other misery: rapid, unplanned industrial growth that packed people together, without any thought for their basic needs. Clean water and proper sanitation cost money and planning, and both were in short supply where the working poor were concerned. So the water stayed dangerous, the cholera kept coming, and people kept dying of something as fundamental as thirst, in towns supposedly at the cutting edge of human progress. Measure this against the modern miracle of the tap: clean, safe water flowing freely, treated and tested, taken so completely for granted that we forget it was ever otherwise. The vast public works of sanitation and water treatment, the sewers and filtration systems that keep waterborne disease at bay, all grew from the hard lessons of exactly these epidemics. So you eye the water warily, reach for the weak beer instead, and do the strange arithmetic of survival that this world demands, where even a drink to quench your thirst is a calculated risk, and beer is the healthy choice. After a day like this, is it any wonder people wanted a drink? The pub was warm, it was loud in a friendly way for once, and gin was cheap enough to briefly erase the memory of the factory floor. For many workers, it was the only comfort available, a small glowing pocket of relief in an otherwise merciless week. Of course, drinking away your already meagre wages had its own consequences, trapping some families in a spiral of debt and despair. But when your other option is contemplating your lungs, a warm glass of forgetting starts to look pretty reasonable. After everything the mill demands of you, the noise, the heat, the danger, the exhaustion, the fear, the pull of the pub is entirely understandable. It offered the things the rest of your life so thoroughly denied. Warmth, first of all, a heated room to thaw the cold that lived in your bones. Noise of a different kind, the friendly clamour of voices and laughter rather than the murderous roar of machinery. Company, comfort, a place to sit that wasn't your cramped room or your station at the loom. For a few hours the pub was a haven, and it's no mystery why so many sought it. And then there was the drink itself, cheap and plentiful and blessedly effective at dulling the sharp edges of the day. Gin in particular was inexpensive enough for even the poorest workers to afford, and it did what it promised. It softened the memory of the factory, quieted the aching body, and offered a brief, warm oblivion in which none of it mattered quite so much. For people whose lives held precious little pleasure, that oblivion was intoxicating in every sense, a rare and accessible relief from a reality that offered almost none. For many, the pub was genuinely the only comfort available, the single bright spot in a week made entirely of grinding labour. It was where the community gathered, where friendships were maintained, where a person could feel, however briefly, like something more than a component in a machine. That glowing pocket of warmth and forgetting was for a great many workers the closest thing to happiness their circumstances allowed. To begrudge them, it would be to misunderstand entirely how little else they had. But the comfort came with a cost, and for some the cost was ruinous. The wages spent on drink were wages not spent on food, rent and family, and those wages were already stretched to breaking. For families where drinking consumed too much of an already meagre income, the result could be deepening poverty, debt, hunger, and the slow disintegration of the household. The relief of the pub could curdle into dependency, and dependency into disaster, trapping some in a spiral that made a hard life immeasurably harder. The escape sometimes became another cage, so the pub sat at the centre of a genuine tension in working-class life, a source of real comfort and real ruin, sometimes for the same family, sometimes in the same week. It offered warmth and relief and community, and it threatened debt and despair and worse. It was neither simple villain nor simple saviour, but a complicated refuge for people with too few refuges and too many reasons to need one. You can hold both truths at once, and you should. The worker seeking a warm glass of forgetting after a 14-hour shift wasn't weak or foolish. They were human, reaching for the only comfort within reach. And the family undone by drink wasn't a moral failure. It was a casualty of a system that offered escape and then punished the escaping. When your alternative is contemplating your ruined lungs in a damp room in the dark, a warm glass of forgetting starts to look not just reasonable, but nearly inevitable. Sunday is your single day off, and it is glorious precisely because it is so rare. There's church in the morning, which offers a bit of peace, and the only reliable heating you'll encounter all week, and then a few precious hours that are actually genuinely yours. You might see family, mend your clothes, rest your ruined feet, or simply sit and stare at a wall in blissful bell-free silence. It's not much, but after 6 days inside a machine, one quiet day feels like a small miracle you've personally earned in blood and cotton. One day, that's what you get. A single day of rest out of 7, and it stands out against the grinding week like a lone candle in a dark room. 6 days of the mill, and then Sunday, when the bell finally sleeps and the machine falls silent and your time, for a few short hours, belongs to you. The rarity is exactly what makes it precious. When rest is this scarce, a single free day becomes something close to sacred, savoured with an intensity that people with weekends could scarcely understand. The day often begins with church, which served purposes both spiritual and delightfully practical. There was the peace of it, the quiet, the sense of meaning and community that offered genuine comfort to hard lives. And there was, not insignificantly, the heat. Church was frequently the only reliably warm building a poor worker might sit in all week, and a warm pew on a cold Sunday morning was a comfort in its own right. Faith and warmth arrived together, and both were welcome after a week that offered neither. Then came the truly precious part, a few hours that were actually your own, unclaimed by the mill, unmarked by any bell. What you did with them was wonderfully up to you. You might spend the time with family, catching up on the connection that the working week so thoroughly crowded out. You might mend your worn clothes, tend to the small maintenance of a life that had no other time for it. You might rest your battered feet, letting your abused body recover a little before the week claimed it again. Or you might simply sit doing nothing at all, luxuriating in the sheer stillness and silence. And oh, the silence. After 6 days immersed in the murderous roar of the machinery, the quiet of a Sunday was a physical pleasure. No clattering looms, no shrieking mechanisms, no phantom ringing in your ears building on itself, just peace. Real peace. The absence of the sound that had filled your every waking hour all week. To sit in stillness, to hear yourself think, to exist for a moment outside the noise, was a comfort so profound that even staring blankly at a wall could feel like bliss. The nothing was the point. The nothing was earned, because you had earned it, thoroughly and undeniably, in the currency the mill dealt in. Sweat, aching muscles, inhaled cotton, 6 days of your one and only life given over to the machine. This single day of rest was payment for all of that, a small return on an enormous outlay, and you claimed it with the fierce appreciation of someone who knew exactly what it cost. Tomorrow the week would begin again, the knocker-upper's stick, the gate, the roar, the strap. But today, for these few hours, none of it could touch you. Consider the modern weekend, 2 whole days routinely, plus holidays, plus the general expectation that rest is a regular and rightful part of life. Consider how easily we let those days slip by, half noticed. Then imagine building your entire sense of rest and recovery around a single precious Sunday, earned in blood and cotton, and treasured precisely because it was all you got. So you savour your one quiet day, feet up, week behind you, bell asleep at last, and you let the blessed silence do its healing work while it lasts. Fall ill in Victorian factory life and you enter a truly terrifying gamble, because there's no sick pay, no doctor you can afford, and no job waiting for you if you stay home too long. Workers drag themselves to the floor with fevers, injuries and hacking coughs, because the alternative, lost wages and possible dismissal, was worse than the illness. Disease spread easily through the crowded, filthy conditions, and a minor infection could spiral into something fatal with alarming speed. Your body was expected to keep functioning like the machines, except no one ever bothered to maintain it. Illness, which is merely inconvenient for most of us now, was in this world a genuine catastrophe waiting to happen. The reason was brutally simple. There was no safety net of any kind. No sick pay meant that a day not worked was a day not earned, and your wages were already too thin to absorb the loss. No affordable medical care meant that treatment, when it existed, was often beyond your reach, and no job security meant that staying home to recover risked your position entirely. Miss too many days and you'd find yourself replaced, your livelihood gone along with your health. To be sick was to be caught between your body's needs and your family's survival, with no good option available. So workers did the only thing the system left them to do. They kept working, sick or not. They dragged themselves to the factory floor with fevers burning, with injuries barely tended, with coughs that racked their whole bodies, because the alternative was worse than the suffering. Rest, the very thing their bodies desperately needed, was a luxury they couldn't afford. They laboured through illness that should have kept them in bed, pushing depleted and ailing bodies through 14-hour shifts, because lost wages and possible dismissal loomed larger than any fever. It was a terrible calculus, and they made it daily. Working while sick, of course, made everything worse, both for the individual and for everyone around them. A body that should have been resting and recovering was instead being pushed to its limits, which slowed healing, deepened illness, and sometimes turned a survivable condition into a fatal one. And in the crowded, poorly ventilated factory with hundreds of people packed together breathing the same foul air, contagious illness spread with ease. One sick worker became many, disease rippling through the workforce, each infected person forced by the same grim logic to keep working and keep spreading it. The conditions themselves were a perfect incubator for sickness. The filth, the crowding, the bad air, the contaminated water, the exhaustion, the poor nutrition, all of it conspired to make workers vulnerable to disease and to help disease spread once it took hold. A minor infection that would be trivial today could, in a weakened body and an unsanitary environment, spiral rapidly into something deadly. Without antibiotics, without proper care, without even the ability to rest, small ailments carried real lethal potential. People died of things that now barely warrant a second thought. The underlying expectation was as inhuman as everything else about the mill. Your body was supposed to keep functioning like the machinery, day after day, without fail. But unlike the machines, which were oiled and maintained and repaired, the human workers received no such care. They were expected to run continuously, while being given nothing to keep them running, no rest, no medicine, no maintenance of any kind. When a body broke down, it wasn't repaired. It was replaced, discarded like a worn part and forgotten. Set this against the modern architecture of sick leave, affordable health care, job protection, and the basic principle that illness shouldn't cost you your livelihood or your life. Every one of those protections answers a specific cruelty of this era, when getting sick meant gambling everything. So you push through your own aches and fevers, dragging your ailing body to the floor because you must, hoping it holds together one more day, because in this world, your health is entirely your own problem, and the machine does not wait. And so we arrive, as we always do, at the end. Life expectancy in the industrial towns was brutally short, dragged down by disease, accidents, poor food, foul air, and the simple grinding exhaustion of it all. Many factory workers were worn out or dead by an age we'd now consider the prime of life, their bodies used up like any other piece of equipment. There were no pensions, no retirements, no golden years, just work until you couldn't, and then a quiet, crowded churchyard. It's a bleak finish, but it's also a reminder of exactly how far we've come, and of the countless ordinary people who paid for that progress one shift at a time. The numbers, when you look at them, are genuinely grim. Life expectancy in the industrial towns was shockingly low, far below what we'd expect today, and lower still for the working poor who bore the worst of the conditions. All the miseries we've walked through this journey converged on this single, inevitable outcome. The disease bred by filth and foul water, the accidents inflicted by guardless machines, the poor and inadequate food, the lungs clogged with cotton, the sheer relentless exhaustion of days too long and years too hard. Each of these shortened lives, and together they cut them brutally short. Many workers were simply worn out or dead by an age we'd now consider the prime of life, the years when a person today might just be hitting their stride. Their bodies, subjected to such relentless abuse, wore out early, used up like any other piece of factory equipment. That's the truth of how the system regarded them, as components, valuable only while functional, discarded when they broke down. Except a machine could be repaired or replaced, while a worn-out worker simply died, having given their body entirely to the labour that consumed them. There was no gentle conclusion waiting, no reward at the end of a lifetime of toil, no pension to soften old age, because there was rarely any old age to soften, no retirement, no rest, no golden years spent enjoying the fruits of a lifetime's labour. There was only work continuing until the body finally failed, and then the end, a quiet, crowded churchyard, an unremarkable grave among many, a life of extraordinary endurance concluded without ceremony or acknowledgement. You worked until you couldn't, and then you were gone, and the mill carried on without you. The anonymity of it is part of the sorrow. These were countless ordinary people, each with a whole inner life, a family, hopes, small joys stolen where they could be found, and the vast majority of them left no mark that history bothered to record. They lived and suffered and endured and died in their millions, the nameless engine of an industrial age that remembered its owners and its inventions, but forgot the human beings who actually turned its wheels. Their individual stories dissolved into the general mass, their sacrifices absorbed into progress and largely uncredited. And yet, and this is the thing worth holding on to, their suffering was not without meaning, even if they never saw the return on it themselves. The very horrors of their lives eventually provoked change. The labour laws, the safety regulations, the limits on hours, the protections for children, the sanitation reforms, the entire slow, hard-won architecture of a more humane world. Every comfort and protection we now take for granted was built, in part on the backs of people who had none of it, whose endless bad days forced a reckoning that made better days possible for those who came after. So this is where their story ends, in the sooty churchyard, and where our gratitude ought to begin. They paid for our progress one shift at a time, one breath of cotton at a time, one exhausting, dangerous, underpaid day at a time. They didn't survive to enjoy the world their suffering helped create. But we get to, and the least we can do is remember exactly what it cost. It's a bleak finish, but it carries within it the whole measure of how far we've come and the countless ordinary people who carried us there. So there it is, a single day in the life of a Victorian factory worker, from the stranger's stick tapping your window in the freezing dark to the long aching shuffle home beneath the gas lamps. You woke before the sun, ate cold bread on your feet, raced a merciless bell, and stepped into a roaring, steaming, dust-choked cavern that treated your fingers as a suggestion. You breathed the cotton snow, dodged the overseer's strap, watched children crawl beneath live machines, and finish the day poorer than you started thanks to a fine for whistling. You did it for 14 hours, and then you got up and did it again. It's easy to laugh at how absurd it all was. The knocker-upper, the nailed-shut windows, the beer that was somehow the healthy choice. Because laughing is often the only sane response to a world this relentlessly hard. But underneath the absurdity were real people, millions of them, ordinary men and women and children who endured the unendurable simply because they had no other choice. They were exhausted, underfed, half-deafened, and permanently afraid, and still they rose every morning, laced up their boots and walked into the machine. That's not weakness. That's a kind of stubborn, quiet heroism that most of us will never be asked to summon. And here's the thing worth carrying with you as you drift off. They didn't suffer for nothing. Every protection we take for granted, the 8-hour day, the weekend, the safe workplace, the laws that keep children in schools instead of under looms, was paid for by people exactly like the ones we've spent tonight with. They never got to enjoy the world their endurance helped build. We did. We do every single day. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, in your quiet room, with clean water a tap away and no bell waiting to ruin your morning, maybe whisper a small thank you to those nameless workers who breathed the cotton so that you wouldn't have to. Because history may be brutal and grimy and deeply unfair, but it's also proof that people are astonishingly tough, quietly hopeful, and capable of carrying impossible burdens one shift at a time, so that someone someday could finally rest. Sleep well. You've earned it. And so, long ago did they.